Hi, I'm Shannon, the podcast producer here at C-SPAN, and this week on the Lectures in History podcast, a discussion on the evolution of civil rights law and efforts to dismantle Jim Crow and racial segregation. Texas A&M history professor Malachi Crawford outlines the civil rights movement and the 1954 Brown v. Board of Education Supreme Court decision, which declared public education segregation to be unconstitutional. Class starts right after this.
Hi, I'm Tammy, and joining me today is Paul, as we celebrate 45 years of C-SPAN's unblinking eye on the democratic process.
That's right, Tammy. Since our founding in 1979, C-SPAN has been documenting history with a unique approach, unfiltered, without commentary, and entirely independent from government funding. C-SPAN is funded by fees from our cable and satellite distribution partners, and now with fewer people subscribing to cable and satellite, we're asking you to help support our next 45 years.
It's amazing to see how C-SPAN has adapted and grown. With the rise of digital platforms and social media, C-SPAN has expanded its reach, so no matter where you are, you have 24/7, 365 access to the democratic process.
And as we navigate this ever-changing media environment, C-SPAN's dedication to putting you in the rooms where politics is debated and policy is determined will not waver.
We ask you to support C-SPAN's vital mission. As we celebrate 45 years of service, your contribution helps us to continue to adapt and grow in this digital age. Visit cspan.org/donate to make your contribution today.
Here's to 45 more years of bringing democracy directly to you wherever you get your news. Thank you for your support. Visit cspan.org/donate today to make a difference.
Today's class is over the fall of Jim Crow, Charles Hamilton Houston, and the road to Brown versus Board of Education, 1954. So today we'll talk a little bit about this major figure in African American history, Charles Houston, who's really important because he uses American law to dismantle the legal structure and the system that supports and upholds racial segregation in America. He's a phenomenal person. Most people don't know him, but they're more familiar with his students. And we'll talk, or I'll just mention some of those individuals like Thurgood Marshall, the first Supreme Court Justice, as well as Pauli Murray, who helped to write the brief that leads to what we come to know today as Title IX legislation, and Constance Baker Motley, William Hasely, other individuals that are associated with Houston and the Howard University School of Law. Houston is significant, among other things. He's responsible for creating what becomes known as the civil rights lawyer. This group and cadre of individuals that will use American constitutional law to fundamentally change racial segregation and dismantle racial segregation in America. So let's talk a little bit about Charles Hamilton Houston and the fall of Jim Crow. Now, there's this idea among some scholars of history that each of us are sort of born for a purpose. We're born, we're not born accidentally, but we're born to meet and to respond to some challenge in our lives. And that definitely seems to be the case with Charles Hamilton Houston. Houston is born in 1895 in Washington, D.C. He's born into a middle-class African-American family. His father is a lawyer by training. His father graduated from Howard University School of Law. At this time, African-American lawyers, late 19th century, late 1800s, African-American lawyers didn't really make a lot of money. So if you were a lawyer, you were a black lawyer, and you had, and that was sort of your practice, you generally had some other job that you did. And that was the case with Charles Hamilton Houston's father as well. But he's born in Washington, D.C., to a middle-class African-American family. And 1 year after his birth, we see the Supreme Court decision, Plessy versus Ferguson, which really legalizes Jim Crow racial segregation through American law, and sanctions what becomes known as the separate but equal doctrine in American law. In doing so, and this is very important, the Plessy versus Ferguson case overthrows the 14th Amendment's Equal Protection Clause. that essentially says that everybody can come before the courts, and the Constitution, the laws are to apply to everybody in the same fashion. And so that's the circumstance within which he's born into. So we have to acknowledge that. Now, Houston is as a student, as a young person, he excelled at his studies. I want to say he graduated school at the age of 15, and he will enter into Amherst College, this very prestigious college in the Northeast, and he'll finish his studies there. And following his graduation from Amherst, he'll enlist into the U.S. military during World War I, okay, as a second lieutenant. So he's one of the few black officers that actually goes and fights or goes to Europe during World War I. It's very important because there are not many, but when we look at Charles Hamilton Houston as a figure, it's important to understand that he's going to use his experience in the military as well as his legal experience. Both of those things are going to really impact and shape how his approach to dismantling racial segregation in American law. He's an officer, so do understand that he thinks strategically. When we look at Houston, one of the things in World War I, one of the things that is really important to note is the experience that black officers go through during that time. We didn't talk a lot about World War I at all, and the experience of black military personnel there. But just to give you some sort of idea, African-American soldiers were segregated. The general at the time from their white counterparts, the general at the time who was commander over all U.S. military personnel, his name was John J. Pershing. And he was over the American Expeditionary Forces. That was the sort of America's combat force that was sent to Europe. Now, the thing about Pershing is that although he had at one point in his life commanded black soldiers, by the time that he becomes the commander over American military forces in Europe for World War I, he's going to be implementing the policy of the Wilson administration, which is to, racially segregate the U.S. military. And one of the things that he does in 1918 is he sends this memo to his French counterparts, to the Allied High Command. And the title of this memo is called The Secret Information Concerning Blacks. It's very important because it really does outline sort of the approach of the U.S. military to black military personnel at the time. One of the things that this document does, and I'll slow down a little bit because I know some of you are writing, but one of the things that this document does, the secret information concerning black troops, is that Pershing essentially tells his counterparts in France that they should not, associate with or fraternize with black soldiers. They should not really give them any type of sense of equality or commend them in any type of way, or give them any type, or spoil. The term that he uses is that his European counterparts should not spoil black military personnel. And so this is the situation that Houston finds himself in at the time. Now, in addition to this experience, when we look at his overall strategy, when we look at, and I'll talk about that in just a second, I'll talk about when he gets to Howard Law School. But when we talk about Houston and his military experience, it's important to know what's referred to as the racial science of the day. The racial science of the day, okay? So in your notes, you can put racial science. And the racial science of the day was based off of a lot of assumptions or assertions. One of the fundamental premises that supported or that shaped the racial science of the day was this notion that people of African descent, African Americans, were fundamentally were fundamentally emotional beings. Okay, emotional beings. And by emotional beings, they're really saying, or what was really being said was that people of African descent were mentally weak. Okay, now there's some gender context associated with emotion, the inability to reason, and being mentally weak. Okay, but this was sort of this fundamental assertion. And because it's a science, the racial science, whenever the talk of integration would be broached, whether you're talking about the experience of black soldiers at war, military soldiers, or the integration, at this time wasn't really even being discussed, but the integration of black kids or children in public schools or in higher education, the notion was that, again, that black people or African Americans were emotional beings. And if you had to sort of write out an equation that was associated with the experiment, because it was always couched as an experiment, integration, the notion that black soldiers could fight alongside white soldiers or black children could sit alongside white children. If you had to write out sort of an equation or a research question associated with the notion of this racial science, it would be, would exposure to a hostile environment, okay, would exposure to a hostile environment induce or bring about an emotional response on the part of the Negro or African American? Okay, I'll just say that again. For those of you who your background is in science, so this is a research question, and the research question is, will exposure to a hostile environment, in this case, in combat, it would be war. In school, it would be sort of the school experience, right? Hostile environment being the independent variable, something that is manipulated, right? Bring about or induce an emotional response, okay? An emotional response being that dependent variable, something that is being measured. Put simply, will African Americans break under the stress of or demands of the rigors of war or the rigors of academia? Okay, that was always what was being tested. Okay. And Charles Hamilton Houston, in terms of his approach to law, one of the things that you'll see when, and we won't talk about it here, but for those of you who are going to law school or will study Charles Hamilton Houston a little bit more, the litigants that the NAACP selects to actually go into the courts and challenge racial segregation in education, most of them will be military veterans. There are a few that aren't, but most of them will be military veterans. And it was all based off of this notion that, these individuals have this background, this experience where they can go into a space and sort of submit or subdue their emotional response to a very hostile environment. That was always a challenge. If you see the integration of the Little Rock Nine and the integration of Central High School, all of that has to do with sort of being this notion that African Americans have to, in a hostile environment, subdue their emotional response. All right. In 1920, Charles Hamilton Houston enters Harvard University, okay? And as he did as a student, he excels in his studies, absolutely excels. In fact, Houston becomes the first African-American editor of the Harvard Law Review. Becomes the first African-American editor of the Harvard Law Review, nation's foremost sort of scholarly legal journal at the time. This is someone who's editing the scholarship that's coming through that journal. He's the head of it. And to give you some parallel, one of the few other African-American editors of the Harvard Law Review was Barack Obama. Okay, so it's an amazing accomplishment that he achieves at this early age. In 1922, Charles Hamilton Houston graduates with his Bachelor's of Law from Harvard University. Again, he's thinking strategically about how he's going to dismantle racial segregation, the law. And Houston is someone who needs data, who needs information. He needs to sort of see where the problem lies. Okay? He spends another 2 years at Harvard. He gets his Doctor's of Law. But in 1924, when he comes out, Charles Hamilton Houston takes a survey. He does a survey of the U.S. South and African-American access to lawyers in the U.S. South. Okay. At the time, there are about 9 million African-Americans living in the South. Now, the question that I have for you, 9 million African-Americans, how many black lawyers do you think were living in the South at that time? Were working in the South at that time? 9 million African Americans, there are going to be black lawyers. How many do you think were working on behalf of African American interests, serving black clientele at that time? 9 million. How many black? That's a lot. How many black lawyers do you expect? Anybody? Yes, Ms. Elmo. I'm sorry, you said 2? 10. Wow, that's that's very modest, but okay. No, that's good. 10 back through all the U.S. South, the whole South, all the states. That's okay. That's right. Yes. 1 to 25 lawyers. Okay, for 9 million? Jeez, 1,000? Okay, maybe 1 million. So 1 for every 9. Okay, anyone else? Some of you say no?
I was going to say a couple of hundred, maybe.
Couple of hundred? Okay, makes sense. Doesn't seem realistic?
Not really.
About now, there's about 1 million, maybe.
Yeah.
Okay. Anybody else want to talk about number? Perhaps 9 million. Entire U.S. South.
100,000?
Was that? Oh. I'll take out some zeros. It was 100. It was 100. It was 100 black lawyers for a population of 9 million. Obviously, some folks' interests aren't being served. So what is that? What does somebody do the math? 1. That means there's 1 lawyer serving the interest of how many African Americans? 9 million divided by.
What about 1,000, 10,000?
Oh, it's a little bit. 90,000. Yeah, 90,000. 1 lawyer for 90,000 people. It's quite absurd. But what this demonstrated to Houston was that obviously the legal interests of African Americans were not being supported. And you have to challenge that. You have to do something. So if he was going to actually fundamentally overthrow or uproot the legal basis of racial segregation, he needed sort of an army to do so. And by the time he gets through, with Howard University's School of Law, which becomes the citadel, really, within the mid-20th century for the training of African-American civil rights lawyers, or for civil rights lawyers, period, by the time he gets through, nearly a quarter, or 25% of all African-American lawyers will be trained at Howard University School of Law. Okay, that's how fundamental sort of his changes are, and how sort of the influence that he has on sort of legal history at this time. Now, after he graduates from Harvard University and he's done his studies and he's done his surveys that he's taken to see what the situation is, he'll become part of the faculty at Howard University School of Law. This was his father's old alma mater, his institution. He's part of the faculty. Part of the faculty, you can't really implement a lot of changes. But by 1929, it's a very quick turnaround. By 1929, Charles Hamilton Houston will become Dean of the School of Law at Howard University. That's very important. It's very important. You have to understand this man is an officer, right? This man, he thinks strategically, okay? And at an academic institution, if you want to be transformational in terms of creating opportunities for your faculty to do innovative research, creating opportunities for your students to do sort of innovative studies and experiments. The position of dean is where that happens, okay? All of the creativity and innovation that happens within a college in a space happens at the level of the dean. That's where transformation happens. And so those of you looking at, don't just think about the degree that you're getting, but one day you might become a dean. And this is an individual who understood that if he was going to transform African Americans' relationship to the law, he had to get that position. And he does so in a relatively short amount of time, okay? Transformational. And so he 1929 begins to implement changes to Howard University's School of Law that will lead to the emergence of the civil rights lawyer and what becomes known as Brown versus Board of Education. Let's look at some of those changes. Let's talk about a few of those changes or initiatives that he makes. Most of these changes will take place between 1929 and 1934. The ones that I'm going to talk about happen within a 2-year period, 1929 to 1931. Okay. Again, and you have to think of this as, the dean is like a coach in a way. The dean is like a coach of a football team, and if you become that coach and you begin to implement changes, what do you think the response is going to be sometimes? Like, what's the response? I'm coming in with a new system, how are people going to respond? Or a football or a basketball coach or a volleyball coach, I'm changing everything. How are people going to respond to that? Generally. Some pushback? Okay. All right. And there's going to be some pushback, and we'll talk about from who. But what else? Some other changes or responses to people implementing new ideas and changes.
There might be people who were looking for the change, and someone probably had to be that person to do it.
Okay, definitely some of the students, because one of the students, as I mentioned earlier, will be Thurgood Marshall. He'll be part or sort of witness some of these changes. Anyone else?
Someone who's trying to take away potential funding or protesting against.
Definitely. And so let's talk about what happens. Let's talk about the first change. So all of you are correct. Let's talk about the first change. Imagine a new person. He has ideas that he's held within his constitution, within himself, since he was at Harvard University. Actually, since he was in the U.S. military as an officer, and the discrimination that he faced as an officer. Like, I don't want that to ever happen again to any other African Americans. And so he'll begin to implement these changes, but he's not in the position yet until 1929. Let's talk about the first change. The first change is that he implements in 1929. He turns Howard University School of Law from a part-time night school to a full-time day school. Part-time night school to a full-time day school.
Why was it a night school?
That's a great question. Students, does anybody have an answer? I'll call on your colleagues. 50-50.
I think it was a night school because, again, at this time, it's 1929 around the time.
Yeah.
It's a HBCU. It's not going to get as high remarks as like a Harvard or a Yale. Mm-hmm. So it's just like, we're going to sweep it under the rug. It's not.
Okay, that's a good response. Anyone else? Ms. Gossett, you had it?
I just said I don't think that's working.
Okay, so what is your?
Yeah, what do you?
Ms. Kelsey doesn't think that's right.
No.
So what do you think?
Oh.
Oh, okay. But the mic's not on.
It is, it's for our cameras.
So, night school. Why is it a night school? Part-time night school. Y'all know this.
People
Your
working.
students. People working. People are working. And so their students, and as I mentioned before, most lawyers aren't going to be making a lot of money. It's not until the Great Migration, until people begin to move northward, until black lawyers, for the most part, will have the clientele to support. 1930s really onward, till African-American lawyers will have the clientele to support them, and they won't have to have other types of jobs. Okay? They're students, they're working. And when he makes this change, the population that is most upset are the alumni. Oh, the alumni are upset. And they say to Houston, you don't understand your students. Here you are with this Harvard University education, coming to this HBCU, making these changes, acting like it's Harvard. You don't understand your students, right? Charles Hamilton Houston responds essentially, I'm going to war with the system of racial segregation, legalized racial segregation in America. I'm trying to use the Constitution to dismantle this system that constructs and organizes everybody in terms of how they relate one to another, right? I'm trying to dismantle that system. And I can't go to war with part-time students. We are going up against the nation's best. This is a Supreme Court ruling that upholds racial segregation in America. We're going up against the nation's best, and if I'm going to war, I have to go to war with students that study the law full-time, not part-time. This is this guy, right? This military officer, former military officer. So he makes that transition. And as I mentioned, you begin to make these changes. People get upset. Alumni are important because what do alumni provide generally for an institute? Money, right? That's your donor base. And they're upset and they're saying, look at this, newbie. So when you begin to make those changes as a new coach or a new dean, you generally have a very short turnaround time between in terms of when you need to make something happen. You need to make it happen. And so we're going to see what takes place in the case of Charles Hamilton Houston. The second change that he does is he increases the number of books in the library, the law library, the number of books or the number of volumes in the law library. And that serves two purposes. It serves two purposes. First, increases the number of books in the university's law library. Two purposes. First, he does it because in terms of the formula for accrediting the body that accredits law schools, part of that formula is based on the number of books in the library that students have access to. Seems logical. Seems logical, right? And the second reason, more sort of related, fundamental, he needs students that are committed to doing research. He needs students that are committed to doing research. You can't overturn the nation's premier law that supports or ruling that supports racial segregation, Plessy versus Ferguson, unless you have students that understand the law. In the same way that if you're an athlete that you need to go to the weight room, right? The premier teams, you can't be a premier team unless you're going to the weight room or you're working out or doing some type of, some exercises that transform your body. As a student, you need a library to do those same things, okay? If you're not in the library, then you're not trying to be transformational. You're trying to be transitional. You're just trying to get a degree. There's a difference. He's trying to be transformational with the information and the knowledge that he provides. And the third thing that he does, he starts moot court competitions at Howard University. Moot court competitions. M-O-O-T, moot court competitions. What's moot court? What's moot court? Again, Howard, yes.
Is it like the type of court that the students do like a playthrough of court process? Yes. And they compete to see who wins?
What's the difference between that and a mock one?
Right.
What's the difference between that?
That and a mock.
Well, it's called moot court. The formal term is moot court. Yeah. And so, moot court is where students present oral arguments, they write briefs, and they present those before the faculty that shut them down. No, but that help them, that help them with their arguments. And here's the thing. We're not talking about going to trial and arguing evidence, right, at the basic, trial level and arguing evidence. We're talking about people changing the law. And in order to change the law, you have to practice making those arguments at the appellate and Supreme Court level. How do you do that without practice? Moot court competition. How do you become a chemist without a laboratory? right? Or a biologist without some type of practice beforehand. It's impossible. He fundamentally changes Howard University School of Law as an institution. It becomes the nation's premier institution for turning out civil rights lawyers. Hands down. Second to none. More individuals from this school will bring cases before the Supreme Court in the decades of the 50s and 60s with respect to civil rights law than anybody else. Fundamentally transforms. Okay, and we'll talk about a few of those. I told you he had a short time, because he's making these changes. Started in 1929. By 1931, the American Bar Association has accredited Howard University School of Law. 2 years. That's phenomenal. That's phenomenal. You're turning out lawyers. Okay, turning out lawyers, making changes. Questions? I'm going to pause for a second because I've talked fast. And yes, what we got?
Yes, so before they were accredited, before they had their accreditation, like, what did it mean before then? I know they were still producing lawyers, but what exactly does being accredited do for the institution?
That's an excellent question. What does accreditation do for an institution? Students. What does accreditation do for students? Do for an institution? Or funding, that's possible, yeah, okay. What else? Is Prairie View accredited? It is. Okay, so you should know. Does that matter? Would you select a university that was not accredited by some, regional governing body? I'd have to hope not. But what that generally does is say that this institution has met certain standards that are recognized within higher education, or in this case, law schools, that suggest that this is a legitimate institution, that the degree from this institution meets the standards for turning out professional, in this case, lawyers, right? Yes.
Do you think that Howard's prestige was because of this man's change in their law school? Like the prestige that they have now?
Oh, definitely. So you all should be aware that, yes, Howard University School of Law, it does still have this prestigious reputation, but it's definitely tied to Charles Hamilton Houston. Even though, most people would associate Howard University's law school with Thurgood Marshall, but Marshall is Houston's student working alongside Houston, right? Marshall will become special counsel for the national NAACP after Charles Hamilton Houston leaves that post, and returns back to the faculty at Howard University School of Law. So without these changes, again, if you're going to be transformational in your position as as an administrator, you are your students now. But if you can think ahead, your students now, but if you can just imagine yourself, a decade from now or just ahead, whatever changes that you are unhappy with now within the world, you need to start now. And that's what Houston did as a young man, as a young officer in the U.S. military. He envisioned himself, and then he went about putting himself in a space where he would be able to make those changes. He didn't live long enough. He'll die. Actually, Houston dies April 22nd, 1950. He doesn't get to see Brown versus Board of Education, but he definitely sets things in motion. Today's April 23rd, so, 74 years from the date. Was the date of his passing. Any other questions? Good questions. Okay. So, who are some of the students that we see associated with Thurgood Marshall? With Charles Hamilton Houston or the Howard University School of Law? Thurgood Marshall, first Supreme Court Justice. Pauli Murray, mentioned Pauli Murray earlier in terms of her work on what's referred to as Jane Crow, the application of the Equal Protection Clause to gender discrimination, right? And so we have Title IX legislation to protect the rights of women in education and elsewhere. Edward W. Jacko Jr., becomes the chief legal counsel for the Nation of Islam, and he will be instrumental in protecting prisoner rights throughout the country. And there is some carryover here in Texas, but most of that work, a lot of that work will be done by Mexican-American inmates, prisoners who corresponded with the Nation of Islam. Okay. All right. So we've talked about some of those changes. I want to just for a second, just transition for a second away from Charles Hamilton Houston, because although he's doing this work at Howard University, there's some things that are going on nationally that we also have to pay attention to. And I want to just quickly talk about some changes in race relations, right, that might have indicated that things were getting better. I don't know. Perhaps. We'll see. You all can judge for yourself, okay? The interwar years. He's going to be doing this stuff, right? We mentioned, or, you should know that the U.S. enters World War I in December of 1941. Now, when that happens, obviously the country is going to be mobilizing to war. And the state of the country is such that discrimination is still, racial discrimination and segregation is still sort of the order of the day. And so you're going to see people organizing. Now, we're not going to see sort of a mass mobilization in terms of sort of the education of the masses that we see, political education of the masses that we see in the 60s and to some extent in the 50s. Happened during this time, but the leaders, individuals like A. Philip Randolph, who was the head of the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters, and I'll repeat that in just a second, but it's the biggest labor union for African Americans at the time. A. Philip Randolph was the head of the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters. So he knows how to organize. And that's important. These individuals are important because they work with the trains. And if they stop working as the country is mobilizing to war, then all of those soldiers and everybody else who are trying to enroll and enlist in the military, all of that sort of comes to a halt because they're not moving baggage, they're not moving luggage, they're not moving freight, they're not doing any of that. Nobody's touching that, right? And so one of the things that happens during this period is that looking at racial discrimination in the defense industry and jobs in the defense industry, A. Philip Randolph essentially says to the government that if racial discrimination was not dealt with, then he would lead a march on Washington and his union would strike. Again, as the country is mobilizing towards war, that is a critical, it's just a critical moment. And the symbolism of African Americans, marching on Washington at a time when the nation is suggesting that it's fighting for democracy abroad, is the type of public relations that the president at the time, Franklin Roosevelt, does not want. And so in 1941, Roosevelt issues Executive Order 8802. Roosevelt issues Executive Order 8802. It establishes the Fair Employment Practices Committee. And essentially, what the order does and that committee does is it tries to ensure or to eliminate racial discrimination in defense industry jobs. The threat of the March on Washington. This is before 1963, the March on Washington that we know of. That idea came from this idea here. Any questions? Questions about it? Yes.
So essentially, Dr. King got this idea from...
Yeah, and he worked alongside. So it wasn't... So there are a couple of things that happened in 1963. August 1963, people are upset. for a number of reasons. Things have happened. We haven't sort of gotten there yet. But the people, just ordinary people, were threatening to bring Washington, D.C. to a standstill, to a halt, the nation's capital to a halt. People were threatening. So we talk about protests today. That's a good question. We talk about protests today and people marching, which is also a form of sort of the military. Again, there's this model where the military, like basically the soldier, the citizen soldier, and it comes back to Charles Hamilton Houston. That's the model of protest that we have. We march, we do things like that. But the people at that time weren't trying to march. What they said was they're going to bring the city of the nation's capital to a standstill, to a halt. They're going to sit on the tarmacs of the airport so that the airports can't, the planes can't land, right? The DC's airports in the nation's capital. That's a significant threat. It brings the business of the nation to a halt. It would bring, to some extent, it would bring the business of the nation to a halt. And so what King does in conversation with several other black leaders is get this idea about a march on Washington. But it's a different march because this march on Washington wasn't, the march on Washington in 1941, it wasn't supported by anybody. This was just, we're going to Washington to embarrass the government. March on Washington in 1963 it's paid for, it's supported. There's also, it was planned. It was very planned and strategic. And it was, to some extent, it was constructed to sort of neutralize this other type of protest that ordinary people that weren't Martin Luther King were attempting to do by bringing the nation's capital to a standstill, to a halt. Yeah. So, but yeah, the idea came from A. Philip Randolph, who was in conversation with Houston, with King. Thank you. All right. In addition to that, there was also an indication that there was that people were fundamentally concerned with race relations at the time. 1943 is a very an integral year looking at race relations because there are going to be a number of race riots that happen across the U.S. 1942, 1943. We're going to see race riots with Mexican Americans out in Los Angeles. We're going to see race riots, and the principal race riot that happens during this time is in Detroit, Michigan. A lot of people moving into Detroit, population sort of African Americans more than doubling in size, and you're going to see, the actual area that African Americans are going to be, the livable space that they're going to be allowed to stay in, to reside in, doesn't expand. So there's going to be race riots as a result of that. 1943, the Detroit race riots, June of 1943. As a result of the very violent race riots in Detroit, and in that race riot, we're going to see 34 people die, 25 African Americans, and 9 white Americans. It's important to note, and I'll just say this since I'm on the subject of the Detroit race riot of 1943, that of the 25 African Americans that die, 17 die at the hands of law enforcement. It is not the case with the white Americans that die during this racial violence that takes place. But in response to that event, because it is so stark in terms of sort of drawing the nation's attention to race relations, a number of communities, cities, and state governments will launch race relations committees or committees and commissions to study race relations in their spaces. Okay. That's the case in June of 1943 when Edward Kelly, who's the mayor of Chicago, establishes the Mayor's Committee and Conference on Race Relations. And this committee was simply formed to prevent a race riot from happening in Chicago. Sort of preventative in nature. Okay. I won't go over the details of just how many of these committees and commissions there were, but it is significant. Let's go ahead and turn the corner. We have a few more slides to get through here. This will be the last slide. I'll stop on this slide. Okay. In addition to these changes, or there's actually one slide after this that I just have to mention a few things. In addition to the sort of those social considerations, there are also academic considerations that happen at this time as well that suggested that race relations were changing or need to change. In 1944, Gunnar Myrdal, who was a Swedish sociologist, working alongside African-American social scientists from HBCUs, Howard University, Fisk University, will travel the South and produce this seminal study called An American Dilemma. American Dilemma. It was very well funded. It was funded by the Carnegie Foundation. The most important aspect of this book was its timing. Okay, 1944. It was published during a time when an increasing number of white Americans, and principally decision makers, were concerned about the fate of Nazism and the oppression of peoples around the world. The question that they asked was, could what happened in Nazi Germany happen in America? I see some faces, and so I don't know if we have some potential answers to that question. But yes, that was the question that was asked. Okay, it was, at the time that it was published, the most exhaustive study of race and race relations of the time. It's the most exhaustive study of race and race relations of the time. And Myrdal's book essentially pointed out that the situation and circumstance of African Americans was concretely similar, in America, was concretely similar to that of Jews in Nazi Germany, the Third Reich. Let me make sure that I'm on time. I just want to check something. I don't have my watch. Does somebody have the time? Let me ask. 1:30? Let's see if I can do this in 10 minutes, okay? I didn't mean to keep you this long, but let's just get through this. Horace Cayton and St. Clair Drake and Horace Cayton, they write Black Metropolis, 1945. This book made the point, among other things, it made the argument that if America, based on their studies, if America did not accord African Americans equal rights, there would most likely be radical consequences. And given the situation, 1943 and 1942, as well as 44, the race riots that occurred, there was reason to suspect that that would be the case, that African Americans had reached a point where they would no longer tolerate the type of treatment, as well as a lack of protection under the law. Now, talk about Jackie Robinson. He's going to be the last person that I talk about, and then I'll mention one thing with Harry Truman, and I'll just really quickly, just going through the slides, mention a couple of the cases that are related to Houston's work. Jackie Robinson, and these are sports considerations that would allow us to ask the question if race relations in America were actually beginning to change. Jackie Robinson in 1947 became the first African American to play in Major League Baseball in the modern era. Okay, 1947. And so the question that we have to ask ourselves, that I want you to think about, is whether or not his entrance into baseball was based on what we might say are altruistic reasons or unselfish, ethical reasons. We want the game to get better. We want it to be a better symbol of American democracy, etc., race relations. Or was it done for profit? Race and profit. Is there a relationship between race and profit when we talk about sport? Yes. Okay. Can there be? Is that something that can sometimes drive ticket sales? It's a question we might ask. So let's talk about it. So there's two ways that Jackie Robinson's entrance into Major League Baseball are framed. One is that it was done for altruistic, ethical purposes, and the other is that it was done for profit. Let's talk about both, okay? The first story that I'm going to talk about is called the Charlie Thomas story. And this should be put under the notion that Jackie Robinson's entrance into baseball was done for altruistic reasons, unselfish, ethical reasons. It's called the Charlie Thomas story. And it comes to us from Branch Rickey. Does anybody know who Branch Rickey was?
Isn't he the one who recruited Jackie Robinson?
He was. He was president of the Brooklyn Dodgers. It's called the Charlie Thomas story. And so let's go. Let's talk about it. In the early 1900s, 1904 to be precise, Branch Rickey was coach of a baseball team, the Ohio Wesleyan. And his team was going to play Notre Dame in South Bend, Indiana. When the team gets to South Bend and pull into their lodging space for the day, Charlie Thomas was denied lodging with his teammates. He's the only black athlete on the team. He was denied lodging. The experience is said to have so upset Branch Rickey that he said if he ever got in position to do so, he would make sure that that never happened again, that no African-American player would ever have to suffer that type of disgrace. Okay. Does it make sense? Okay, all right, excellent. Now, that story comes to us from Branch Rickey. This other story also comes to us from Branch Rickey. And you can label this sort of untapped reservoir. And the quote that is attributed to Rickey, Branch Rickey, president of the Brooklyn Dodgers, believed that, quote, African Americans represented the greatest untapped reservoir in the history of Major League Baseball. Okay? Profit, markets, expansion of markets. You introduce African Americans to the game, you expand markets. Okay. And there was reason to support this. Following World War II, African American had an increased sort of median family income. African Americans had also supported Negro League baseball teams in their cities. So there was a notion that, African Americans like baseball, and if you brought their players to this sport, they would follow. So when we look at the emergence of and the integration of Jackie Robinson into Major League Baseball, we also sort of have to think about, why this was done. The other thing that I'll just point out very quickly, his story does sort of, it follows what we've been talking about in terms of racial science, or what I mentioned in terms of racial science. Jackie Robinson is someone who has to subdue when he goes into Major League Baseball, he does have to subdue his emotions despite the fact, and he's working in a hostile environment, he's being spiked. I don't know if you've ever been spiked before, track and field or soccer or some other sport, baseball, but it's painful. And so, despite that, he's challenged not to be emotional, but just to play the game, to achieve. And so, in a lot of ways, his experience does track that. Just really quickly, the thing that I want to note about President Truman, in 1947, Truman established the U.S. Commission on Civil Rights. And this commission issued a report called To Secure These Rights. To Secure These Rights. That's very important. So, we talked about a lot of things in this class, but this, you should just at least note this. 1947, the U.S. Commission on Civil Rights issued a report called To Secure These Rights. And the report stated that racial desegregation was a desirable national goal. So we see these academic studies that are going to influence decision makers and people how they're thinking about race relations. We're also going to see, because there are racial riots, people are going to be thinking about race relations in different ways. And so all of that is going to impact, some would say, the court cases. It's going to create a social environment which was favorable to changing the laws with respect to race and racialized segregation. Just a couple of cases that came before or preceded Brown versus Board of Education that aren't necessarily related to education. In 1946, the Supreme Court ruled that segregation on interstate buses was unconstitutional. And as a result, you're going to see the Freedom Riders later in the 60s, early 60s. In 1948, and we talked about this in class, the case Shelley versus Kramer, the court would declare that restrictive covenants were that limited property to minorities were unenforceable. In 1950, the court declares that laws prohibiting African Americans from eating in railroad dining cars are unconstitutional. On May 17th, 1954, there have been a number of court cases in Oklahoma and Maryland and Missouri that preceded and in Texas, Sweat versus Painter, for those of you familiar, even Sweat, that precede the Brown versus Board of Education case. But on May 17th, 1954, Brown versus Board of Education, the Supreme Court rules that racial segregation in public education is unconstitutional. Okay. That concludes the lecture. Are there any questions? What you got?
Okay, my first question, well, I have many questions, but my main question is going to be about the American dilemma.
Okay.
And I was wondering if they consider the relationship between the black population in America versus the Jewish population in Europe. How come it's so easy for them to get reparations and have, the fact that the Holocaust is such a big issue and will always be a pressing matter in history when slavery was global and we still can't get reparations for it?
So that's a very good question. I don't know if I have the answer within the time frame that we have, but what I'd say is that one of the things that you see with not just, so we're talking about European Jews, for the most part. But there's going to be sort of political support based not only on the Holocaust and the crimes that we see following that, but also tragedy, but also human rights tragedy, but also there's also going to be political support for the creation of the State of Israel for various reasons. They're going to be, governments are going to want to sort of promote and protect their interests in the Middle East, and Israel sort of provides them that space. There's also going to be sort of the history of Europe getting rid of its quote-unquote undesirable population. So there's ethical, there's political, and there's sort of more sort of other reasons why that sort of occurs. The other thing that I would just say is that it's not as if African Americans at this time did not attempt to bring the case of reparations before the UN, okay, in various spaces. In fact, that did happen. There is a document that's called We Charge Genocide. It's very important. It's called We Charge Genocide, and it was produced by the Civil Rights Congress. And it's not statistical, but it just lays out a lot of, it doesn't even get to slavery, but it just lays out like lynching and a lot of the other things, sort of crimes and violence that's been committed against African Americans. But one of the things that happens, two things really happen when African Americans try to push that before the UN. One is that the person who fundamentally stops that is Eleanor Roosevelt. She uses her influence, a friend of the Negro, uses her influence to make sure that the African-American demand for reparations at the UN does not succeed. The other thing that happens is that genocide, the term genocide is defined in such a way that, and this is deliberate, that the U.S. sort of demands this, that it really doesn't capture what happens, the violence that happens to African Americans. It's defined in such a way, it's sort of defined, the African American experience is sort of defined outside of that. And so we have to look at sort of how genocide is defined at the time. And this all happens 1947, 1948, in this very short period of time during this time. So we can question whether race relations were really changing or improving, and at whose expense. Are we progressing so long as we ask for nothing in relation to what has happened to us? And is that a fair deal? I don't know. Right? Is it we can be citizens so long as we never ask for anything that has happened to us in the past? Great question. All right. Is that it? We're all good? Thank you all for coming. Thank you all for wiping the sleep out of your eyes. I appreciate it. And I'll see you all hopefully on Thursday.
Thanks for listening to this week's Lectures in History podcast. To find even more history content, visit c-span.org/AHTV.